Imagine a man who built an empire with his bare hands, wealth beyond dreams, power that shaped cities, only to discover a secret buried for 50 years, a truth that could unravel everything he's ever known. What would you do if the life you thought you mastered turned out to be a lie? Stick around for this journey of grit, regret, and redemption. It's a story that'll grip your heart and leave you questioning what really matters. Hit that like button if you're ready for the ride, and subscribe so you don't miss a single twist. Let's dive in. The office of William Pierce was a cathedral of power, perched on the 40th floor of Pierce Energy's Dallas headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the sprawling Texas plains, where oil rigs stood like silent sentinels under the late afternoon sun. The room smelled faintly of polished mahogany and leather, the desk a slab of dark red wood that gleamed under the soft glow of a brass lamp. At 68, William sat there, a man carved from discipline and ambition, his silver hair swept back, his gray eyes sharp as steel. His suit, tailored, impeccable, hugged his lean frame, and a Patek Philippe watch glinted on his wrist, a quiet testament to decades of success. To the world, he was the unyielding titan of the oil industry. To himself, he was a man who hadn't felt the warmth of a home in years. The silence broke with the sharp click of the door. Eric Holt stepped in, a young reporter with a hungry edge to his smile. His cheap blazer and loosened tie clashed with the room's opulence, but his confidence filled the space like smoke. In his hand, he clutched a recorder, its red light blinking, like an accusation. William didn't rise. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and fixed Holt with a steady gaze. "Mr. Pierce," Holt began, his voice clipped and eager. "People are talking. They say you've got a secret family. Out there, 4 sons you abandoned. Care to tell me the truth?" The words hit like a slap, but William's face didn't flinch. His heart, though, buried deep beneath layers of control, tightened. He'd spent 40 years building an empire brick by brick, deal by deal, until Pierce Energy towered over the Texas oil fields. His name was synonymous with power, his reputation a fortress. And now, this boy, barely 30, thought he could storm it with rumors? William's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice low, and, even when he spoke, "I don't answer to slander, Mr. Holt." Holt smirked undeterred and leaned forward. "It's not slander if it's true. Sources say you walked away from a woman decades ago, left her with 4 kids and never looked back. That's not the William Pierce the world knows, is it? The man who never bends?" William's fingers tightened briefly, the only crack in his composure. Inside, a flicker of something old stirred. Guilt, maybe. Or the ghost of a memory he'd buried under boardroom victories and late-night contracts. Anna. Her name rose unbidden, soft and sharp like a thorn against his conscience. He saw her, for a moment, 20 years old, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, her hands rough from work, but gentle when they touched his. 50 years ago, by a lake in East Texas, he'd promised her everything. And then, he'd given her nothing. He pushed the thought down, deep where it couldn't touch him. His eyes never left Holt's. "If you have evidence, show it. Otherwise, you're wasting my time." Holt slid a grainy photo across the desk. It showed 4 young men, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same square jaw and gray eyes William saw in the mirror every morning. They stood outside a modest house, their faces unfamiliar, yet hauntingly his own. William's breath caught, just for a second, before he schooled it back to calm. He didn't touch the photo. He didn't need to. The resemblance was a punch to the gut, a mirror held up to a past he'd refused to face. "Recognize them," Holt pressed, his tone sharp with triumph. "They're making noise online, Mr. Pierce. People want answers. Your shareholders want answers." William's mind raced, but his face remained a mask. He could feel the weight of his empire pressing down, decades of deals, billions in assets, a legacy he'd forged with his own hands. And now this. A scandal threatening to crack the foundation. He could deny it, call it a lie, let his PR team bury it in press releases and lawsuits. That's what the old William would do. Crush the threat, silence the noise. But something held him back. Those eyes in the photo. His eyes. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked to the window. The oil rig stretched to the horizon, black silhouettes against a sky turning gold. Each one was a monument to his choices. Every late night, every handshake, every time he'd chosen power over love. He told himself it was duty, not ambition. Duty to his mother, who demanded he marry Margaret to secure the family's future. Duty to the company that bore his name. But duty, he realized now, was a cold bedfellow. "I built this," he said, more to himself than Holt, his voice steady as stone. "Every inch of it. If you think a few whispers can tear it down, you don't know me." Holt laughed, a short, cutting sound. "This isn't about your rigs, sir. It's about your soul. People say you sold it a long time ago." William turned, his gaze piercing. He could feel the anger rising, hot, familiar, but he clamped it down with the iron will that had carried him through boardroom battles and oilfield crises. He wouldn't give Holt the satisfaction of a reaction. Not now, not ever. His pride, his self-respect, demanded more. "Get out," he said quietly, the words laced with steel. "And take your recorder with you." Holt hesitated, then shrugged, and pocketed the device. "This isn't over, Pierce. The truth doesn't hide forever." He left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving William alone with the hum of the city below. He sank back into his chair, the photo still lying on the desk like an unanswered question. His hand brushed the drawer where he kept it, the chipped, ceramic mug Anna had given him, inscribed with "Will" in her careful script. He hadn't touched it in years, but he couldn't throw it away. Now, as the light faded outside, he wondered if it was the only piece of her he'd kept, or if those 4 faces in the photo were the real legacy he'd left behind. William Pierce was a man of control, a titan who bent the world to his will. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Not from Holt's words, but from the quiet, insistent pull of a past he couldn't outrun. The Dallas skyline glittered outside William Pierce's penthouse window, a constellation of steel and glass he'd helped shape. Inside, the air was cool and still, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning in his sprawling, empty home. The walls were adorned with oil paintings, scenes of rigs and refineries, victories framed in gold, but they couldn't fill the silence. He stood by the bar, a crystal tumbler of bourbon in hand, the amber liquid catching the light of a single lamp. At 68, William was no stranger to sleepless nights, but tonight was different. The photo Eric Holt had left on his desk, burned in his mind, 4 young men with his eyes, his jaw, his blood. He set the glass down untouched and walked to his study, a smaller room he rarely used. The desk here was simpler, cluttered with old files and a single drawer he hadn't opened in years. His fingers hesitated over the handle, then pulled it free. There it was, the chipped ceramic mug, its white surface dulled by time, the word "will" scratched into it with a shaky hand. Anna's hand. He lifted it carefully, as if it might shatter, and the memory came rushing back like a flood breaking a dam. 50 years ago, East Texas was a different world. He was 18, a lanky kid with grease-stained hands, working rigs to pay for engineering school. Anna Grayson was the girl next door, literally her family's shack a stone's throw from his. She had dark hair that fell in waves, eyes that sparkled like the lake they'd sit by after his shifts. That summer they'd found a spot under an oak tree, its branches dipping low over the water. He could still feel the heat of the sun, the coolness of the grass, the way her laughter danced over the ripples. "Here," she'd said one evening, pressing the mug into his hands. It was cheap, bought from a gas station, but she'd carved his name into it with a pocket knife. "So, you'll remember me when you're rich and famous." He'd grinned, tying her shoelace as it flopped loose again. She was always losing them. "I'll never be too rich for you, Anna." But he had been. 2 years later, his mother cornered him in their cramped kitchen, her voice sharp as a blade. "Margaret Hargrove's father owns half the oil in Texas, William. You marry her, you're set for life. That Grayson girl, she's nothing. Love doesn't drill wells." William had argued, his voice breaking. "It's not about money, Ma. It's about duty," she'd snapped. "You owe this family. You think your father died in that rig accident so you could throw it all away?" The guilt had sunk its claws in deep. He'd gone to Anna that night, the lake silver under the moon. She'd stood there, barefoot, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. "If you choose money," she said softly, "I won't keep you. But don't expect me to wait." "I don't have a choice," he'd whispered, his throat tight. "I'm sorry." She'd nodded, tears glinting in her eyes, and turned away. He'd walked off into the dark, the mug still warm in his pocket, believing he was doing the right thing. Duty over love, family over heart. The next week, he'd married Margaret, a cold ceremony in a church he didn't care about, and buried Anna in the past. Now, holding that mug in his penthouse, William felt the weight of 50 years settle on his shoulders. He'd told himself it was necessity, not ambition, that drove him away. Margaret's father had opened doors, contracts, leases, a fast track to the top. Pierce Energy was born from that choice, a giant built on the bones of a promise he'd broken. But what had it cost him? Margaret was a business partner, not a wife. Childless by mutual disinterest, their marriage a transaction that ended in a quiet divorce 20 years ago. And Anna? He'd assumed she'd moved on, built a life, without him. Until Holt's photo proved otherwise, he set the mug down and sank into the leather chair, staring at the city lights. Those four faces, David, Mark, Luke, John, weren't just echoes of his youth. They were evidence of a life he'd abandoned. Had Anna been pregnant when he left? Had she tried to tell him? The thought gnawed at him, a quiet ache that threatened to unravel the control he'd mastered over decades. He wanted to storm out, demand answers, but that wasn't his way. William Pierce didn't lash out. He didn't break. He calculated. He planned. He endured. His phone buzzed on the desk. A text from his assistant, Clara. "Board's antsy about the rumors. Meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m. He didn't reply. The board could wait. For once, this wasn't about oil or profits. It was about something deeper, something he'd locked away with that mug in the drawer. He stood and walked to the window, the bourbon still untouched behind him. The rigs out there, his rigs, were monuments to his discipline, his self-respect. He'd built them with his own hands, his own will, refusing to bend to storms or strikes or scandals. But now, as the city glowed below, he wondered if they were all he'd leave behind. A legacy of steel and wealth, but no warmth, no connection. The photo, the mug, Anna's name. They were cracks in the armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten. It could break. William pressed a hand to the glass, cool against his palm. He could feel the old anger stirring, the urge to fight, to silence Holt, to bury this mess like he'd buried everything else. But he swallowed it down, his jaw tight, his breath steady. Anger wouldn't answer the questions those gray eyes raised. Only the truth would. And for the first time in 50 years, he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face it. The lake was long gone, paved over by progress, but its shadows lingered in his chest. And somewhere out there, 4 men carried his face, and maybe his regrets. William Pierce, titan of oil, master of control, was about to learn what duty really meant. The drive to Anna's house took William Pierce out of Dallas's gleaming core and into the quiet outskirts, where the city's pulse faded into fields and weathered homes. His Bentley hummed along a narrow road, the leather seats cool against his back, but his hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. The address Clara had dug up sat heavy in his mind. 1427 Rosewood Lane. A modest place, far from the oil fields, and penthouses that defined his world. He didn't know what he'd say when he got there, only that he had to see her, to face the truth those 4 faces in Holt's photo had unearthed. The house came into view as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over a small yard. It was a single-story cottage, paint peeling at the edges with a porch sagging under years of wear. But the garden stopped him cold. Rows of red roses bloomed fiercely against the fading light, their petals vivid against the drab siding. He remembered those roses, Anna planting them by the lake, her hands muddy, her smile brighter than the flowers. "They're tough," she'd said once, wiping dirt on her jeans. "Like us." He'd laughed then. Now, the sight twisted something deep in his chest. He parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his polished shoes loud in the stillness. The air smelled of earth and blooms, a stark contrast to the sterile polish of his office. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, and there she was. Anna Grayson, 67 now, her dark hair gone silver, her face lined with time but still carrying that quiet strength he'd loved. She wore a faded cardigan, her hands clasped tight, and her eyes, those same hazel eyes, met his with a mix of surprise and steel. "William," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What are you doing here?" He opened his mouth, but the words caught. Behind her, 4 men emerged from the shadowed hall, tall, broad-shouldered, their faces a mirror of his own youth. David, the eldest, had a calm intensity. Mark's jaw was set hard, his stance defensive. Luke's eyes flickered with curiosity. John, the youngest, hovered close to Anna, protective. They didn't speak, but their presence filled the porch. Like a wall. William started, then steadied himself. "I saw a photo. Of them. I had to know." Anna's lips pressed thin. "Know what? Exactly?" "If they're mine," he said, his voice low, controlled, though his pulse hammered. "If you, Anna, did I leave you with—" "Stop." Mark stepped forward, his tone sharp, cutting through the dusk. "Who the hell are you to show up here asking questions like you've got a right?" William met his glare, feeling the heat of accusation, the weight of 50 years. He could have snapped back. Decades of commanding boardrooms had honed his edge, but he didn't. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, and kept his voice even. "I'm William Pierce, and I think I might be your father." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rustle of wind through the roses. Mark's fists clenched, but Anna raised a hand, gentle yet firm, holding him back. "He's someone I used to know," she said to her sons, her gaze never leaving William. "A long time ago, that's all." "That's not all," William said, stepping closer, though he kept his distance from the porch. "Anna, I didn't know. If I'd known—" "You didn't want to know," she interrupted, her words like a blade, precise and unyielding. "You chose your path, William. I chose mine." The boys shifted, their eyes darting between them. David spoke, his voice quieter but no less firm. "Mom, why's he here now? After all this time?" Anna hesitated, then sighed, a sound heavy with years. "Because the world's talking, I suppose. And he's scared of what it'll say." William's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. Holt's rumors had lit a fuse, and the board meeting tomorrow loomed like a guillotine. Yet standing here, under her steady gaze, it wasn't the press or the shareholders that shook him. It was her, the woman he'd walked away from, now surrounded by sons he'd never claimed. His sons. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his tone measured, though every word cost him. "I just need the truth." "The truth?" Mark laughed, bitter and short. "You think you can waltz in here with your fancy car and demand that? We don't need you. We never did." Luke tilted his head, studying William. "He looks like us, Mom. Is he—" "No," Anna said quickly, then softer. "Not in the way that matters." William felt the sting, sharp and deep, but he didn't flinch. He could have pressed, could have demanded DNA tests or explanations, but that wasn't his way. Not now. He'd spent a lifetime forcing the world to bend, rigs, deals, men. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was a garden, her garden, and he had no power here. His pride, his self-respect, kept him standing tall, but they also kept him silent. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words raw, unexpected even to himself, "for showing up like this, for everything." Anna's eyes softened, just for a moment before hardening again. "Go home, William. This isn't your place." He nodded once and turned back to the car. The boys watched him go, their stares heavy with questions they didn't voice. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at the roses one last time. She'd kept them alive all these years. Tough, like she'd said. Tougher than him, maybe. He'd walked away from her once, thinking it was strength. Now, driving back into the darkening night, he wasn't so sure. The Bentley purred to life, carrying him back to Dallas, but part of him stayed on that porch, caught in the wind through her garden. He'd come for answers and found only more. Shadows. Shadows of a life he'd abandoned, of a family he'd never known. William Pierce, master of control, felt the first crack in his armor widen. Not from anger or shame, but from the quiet, unyielding strength of the woman he'd left behind. The night was heavy when William Pierce returned to 1427 Rosewood Lane, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hum of crickets. He'd spent the day in Dallas, staring down a boardroom of grim faces demanding answers to Holt's rumors, their voices sharp with impatience. He'd given them nothing, just a steady look and a promise to handle it. Now, hours later, he stood outside Anna's cottage again, the chipped ceramic mug clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The porch light glowed faintly, a beacon in the dark, and he knocked before he could second-guess himself. Anna opened the door, her silver hair loose, her cardigan swapped for a worn flannel shirt. She froze at the sight of him, her hazel eyes narrowing. "William," she said, her voice low, wary. "It's late." "I know," he replied, his tone even despite the knot in his chest. "I couldn't wait." She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. The kitchen was small, the linoleum floor scuffed, the air warm with the smell of chamomile tea. A single bulb hung overhead, casting soft shadows across a wooden table where a cracked teapot sat steaming. Anna gestured to a chair, but he didn't sit. He set the mug on the table instead, its will inscription stark against the faded wood. Her gaze flicked to it, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe pain, before she masked it. "What's this?" she asked, though she knew. "You gave it to me," he said, his voice steady but softer than he meant it to be. "By the lake. I kept it." She didn't touch it. She poured herself tea, her hands steady despite a faint tremble, and sat across from him. "Why are you here, William? Really?" He took a breath, the weight of 50 years pressing down. "I need to know the truth. About them. David, Mark, Luke, John. Are they mine?" Anna sipped her tea, her silence stretching long enough to make him wonder if she'd answer. Then she coughed, a harsh rasping sound that doubled her over, her hand gripping the table. William started forward, instinct overriding restraint, but she waved him off, her breathing ragged. "Mom?" Luke's voice came from the hall, sleepy, but sharp. He appeared in the doorway, his gray eyes, so like William's, wide with concern. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was thin. She straightened, brushing him off with a weak smile. "Go back to bed." Luke lingered, glancing at William with a mix of curiosity and distrust, then nodded and left. The room fell quiet again, but the cough hung between them like a warning. William's chest tightened. "Anna," he said, softer now. "What's wrong?" She looked at him, her gaze piercing through the years. "Nothing you can fix," she said, but her hand shook as she set the cup down. Then, almost reluctantly, she spoke. "They're yours, William. All 4 of them." The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap, reverberating through the steel walls he'd built around himself. He didn't move, didn't blink, but inside, something cracked wide open. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, though it took everything he had to keep it that way. "I did," she said, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation. "I wrote you a letter 3 months after you left, told you I was pregnant. You never answered." He stared at her, the world tilting under his feet. "I didn't get it," he said, the truth dawning cold and sharp. "I never saw a letter." Anna's lips curved, a faint, bitter smile. I figured as much later. Your mother, maybe, or that wife of yours. Someone made sure it didn't reach you, but by then, I'd stopped waiting. The twist sank in, a knife of realization twisting in his gut. Margaret, or his mother, one of them, or both, had buried Anna's plea, locking him into a life of rigs and riches while she raised 4 boys alone. He wanted to rage, to demand how they dared, but he didn't. Not here. Not with her watching him, her eyes steady despite the weariness in them. "Why didn't you try again?" he asked, though he knew it sounded weak. She leaned back, her hands folding in her lap. "Because I didn't want them tied to your world, the money, the power. It's a cage, William. I raised them free with a mother who worked 2 jobs, not a father who'd trade them for oil wells." He flinched inwardly, but his face stayed calm, his discipline a shield. "I wouldn't have traded them," he said quietly. "If I'd known." "You didn't," she cut in, firm but not cruel. "And I didn't need you to. They're good boys, strong. They don't need your name now." The weight of her words settled over him, heavy with finality. He looked at the mug, its chipped edge a silent witness to a promise he'd broken. "And you?" he asked, almost a whisper. "What about you?" She coughed again, softer this time, and her hand pressed briefly to her chest. "I've got cancer," she said, matter of fact, like she was noting the weather. "Not long left, the doctors say. That's why I went to Dallas last week, to settle some things. Didn't expect you to show up." William's breath caught, but he didn't let it show. Cancer. The word echoed, cold and final, and he saw the fragility she'd hidden under her strength. He wanted to reach for her, to say something, anything, but his hands stayed at his sides, his voice locked behind years of restraint. "I'm sorry," he said again, the only words he could find. "For not knowing, for not being there." Anna met his eyes, her gaze softening just enough to hurt. "It's late, William, go home." He nodded, picking up the mug as he stood. The kitchen felt smaller now, the air heavier. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at her. Small, fierce, unbreakable despite the cracks. "I'll be back," he said, a promise he hadn't planned. She didn't reply, just watched him go, the teapot still steaming between them. Outside, the roses glowed under the porch light, tough and alive, like her. William slid into his car, the mug cold in his hand, and drove into the night, the truth sinking deep into his bones. 4 sons, a letter lost, a life stolen, and time running out. The boardroom of Pierce Energy gleamed like a polished blade, its long mahogany table reflecting the harsh glow of recessed lights. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dallas shimmered in the morning haze, a city William Pierce had shaped with his hands and his will. Today, though, it felt like a battlefield. The 12 board members sat stiffly in their leather chairs, their faces a gallery of frowns and furrowed brows. At the head of the table, William stood, his suit crisp, his silver hair swept back, his gray eyes steady despite the storm brewing inside him. In his pocket, the chipped mug pressed against his thigh, a quiet anchor from Anna's kitchen the night before. Chairman Harold Grayson, no relation to Anna, just a cruel twist of fate, leaned forward, his voice gravelly with impatience. "The stock's down 3 points since that damn reporter started flapping his gums, William. Shareholders are calling. We need a statement, now." William's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd woken to headlines screaming across every outlet. Oil Titan's secret sons, Pierce Energy faces scandal. Holt's photo of the 4 boys, David, Mark, Luke, John, had gone viral, their faces plastered beside his own, the resemblance undeniable. Anna's words echoed in his ears. "They're yours." And then softer, sharper. "I've got cancer." He'd barely slept, her cough replaying in his mind, the truth of 50 lost years sinking deeper with every hour. "The rumors are noise," he said, his voice calm, measured, cutting through the tension. "We've weathered worse." "Not like this," Grayson snapped, slamming a hand on the table. "This isn't a strike or a spill, it's personal. People think you abandoned a family. 4 kids, William. That's not the man we've sold to the world. The accusation stung, but William kept his face a mask. He could feel the old instinct rising, to crush the threat, to bury it under lawyers and denials. That's how he'd built this empire. Control, discipline, no cracks. But this wasn't oil or steel. This was blood. His blood. And Anna's time slipping away. What's your plan? Evelyn Carter, the sharp-eyed CFO, chimed in. We can spin it, say it's a lie, Sue Holt, for defamation. But we need you to say it first. William's hand brushed the mug in his pocket, the rough edge grounding him. He thought of Anna's kitchen, the steam from her cracked teapot, the way Luke had looked at her, worried, protective. He thought of the letter she'd sent, lost to someone else's hands. 50 years, 4 sons, and now this. A room full of suits demanding he erase them again. His phone buzzed in his jacket, a text from David, the eldest, sent an hour ago. Saw you on the news. You gonna say we don't exist? The words hit harder than Grayson's bluster, a quiet challenge from a son he'd never known. William's chest tightened, but he didn't let it show. I won't lie, he said finally, his voice low but firm, locking eyes with Grayson. They're my sons. The room erupted. Grayson's face reddened. Evelyn's pen clattered to the table, voices overlapping in a flurry of shock and strategy. You can't just... The press will. The stock. William raised, a hand silencing them, his presence a wall they couldn't breach. I didn't know about them, he continued, his tone unyielding. Not until yesterday. Their mother wrote me 50 years ago. I never got the letter. Someone made sure of that. Grayson leaned back, skepticism etched deep. Convenient. And now, you're what, Father of the Year? No, William said, the word sharp but calm. I'm a man who's done wrong, and I won't make it worse by denying them now. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You're putting the company at risk, William. Sentiment doesn't pay dividends. He met her gaze, unflinching. Integrity does. I've spent 40 years building this. Every rig, every deal. If it can't survive the truth, it's not worth keeping. The board fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Grayson rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath, but didn't argue. William turned to the window, the rigs, dotting the horizon like sentinels of his past. He could feel their stares on his back, judging, calculating. They wanted a fight. Denials, press releases, a clean slate. But he wouldn't give it to them. Not this time. Clara slipped into the room, her tablet glowing with updates. Press conference in an hour, she whispered. Holt's outside with a camera crew. William nodded, dismissing her with a glance. An hour to decide how to face the world. He pulled the mug from his pocket, setting it on the table, a small chipped thing amid the polish of power. Grayson snorted. What's that supposed to be? A reminder, William said, his voice steady, of what I walked away from. He left the boardroom, the mug back in his pocket, and stepped into the elevator alone. The descent was quiet, but his mind roared. Anna's cancer, the boys' faces, Holt's accusations, they pressed against his control, threatening to crack it. He could have dodged this, let the machine of Pierce energy grind it down. But that would mean erasing them again. David's text, Mark's anger, Luke's worry, John's silence, and Anna, fading in that little house with her roses. The lobby buzzed with staff, their whispers trailing him as he walked to the press room. Holt stood at the front, smirking, his recorder ready. Cameras flashed, a sea of lenses trained on him. William took the podium, his hands steady, his face a fortress. I've built Pierce Energy on hard work and honesty, he began, his voice clear, cutting through the noise. Yesterday I learned I have 4 sons, David, Mark, Luke, and John Grayson. I didn't know they existed until now. Their mother reached out 50 years ago and I failed her. I won't fail them again. The room exploded, shouts, questions, shutters clicking, but William didn't waver. Holt yelled over the din, "So you admit you abandoned them?" William met his eyes calm as stone. I admit I was kept from them, now I'm here. That's all you need to know. He stepped down, the crowd parting, and walked out into the Dallas heat. The mug pressed against his leg, a quiet promise. He'd faced the lights and held his ground, not with anger, but with truth. For Anna. For them. For the man he should have been. William Pierce stood in the grand foyer of his Dallas penthouse, the chandelier above casting prisms of light across the marble floor. The city skyline glowed beyond the glass walls, a testament to the empire he'd built. But tonight, it felt hollow. The press conference had left a raw edge in the air, his public admission of 4 sons still rippling through headlines and boardroom whispers. He'd meant every word, but the weight of it pressed heavier now, alone in this sterile palace of wealth. The chipped mug sat on the bar, a quiet relic of Anna's truth, and he traced its edge with a finger, steadying himself for what came next. The doorbell chimed, sharp and unexpected. William straightened, smoothing his jacket, and opened the door. Margaret Hargrove stood there, his ex-wife, her platinum hair swept into a flawless chignon, her designer coat dripping with old money. At 65, she still carried the icy elegance that had once sealed their marriage, a transaction, not a bond. Her blue eyes glinted with something sharp, and William felt a chill settle in his bones. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "What brings you here?" She stepped inside without invitation, her heels clicking on the marble. "You've made quite a mess, William," she said, her tone clipped, cutting. 4 bastards on the evening news? Really?" He closed the door, his jaw tight but his face a mask. "They're my sons," he said evenly. "Not bastards." Margaret laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, please, spare me the sentimentality. You think this little redemption act fools anyone? The board's livid, the stock's tanking, and I'm not about to let my family's name, our name, be dragged through your mud." William's hand brushed the mug in his pocket, grounding him against the rising heat in his chest. He could have snapped. Decades of her cold pragmatism had tested him before. But he didn't. He crossed to the bar, pouring 2 bourbons, and handed her one. "Say what you came to say," he said, his voice steady as stone. She took the glass but didn't drink, her eyes narrowing. "I stopped that letter, William. 50 years ago. Anna Grayson sent it. Pathetic little thing, scrawled on cheap paper begging you to come back. I burned it." The confession hit like a punch, but William didn't flinch. He'd suspected. Anna's words in her kitchen had planted the seed, but hearing it from Margaret's lips turned suspicion into steel. His grip tightened on the glass, but his voice stayed level. "You had no right." "I had every right," she shot back, stepping closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "You were mine. Our marriage was a deal, a merger. Her and her brats would have ruined everything. My father gave you Pierce energy, William. I kept you on that path." The truth twisted deeper, a blade of betrayal he hadn't felt in years. He saw Anna's face, young, tear-streaked by the lake, then older, coughing in her kitchen, raising 4 boys alone because of this woman's choice. He wanted to hurl the glass, to let the fury loose. But he didn't. His discipline, his self-respect, held him fast. "You stole my family," he said, low and deliberate, each word a weight. "You didn't keep me. You broke me." Margaret's smile was thin, unrepentant. "I made you, and now you're throwing it away for some dying woman and her litter. I'll sue you, William. Tie this up in court. Drag it out until those boys get nothing. The Hargrove name stays clean." He set his glass down, the clink loud in the silence. "Do it," he said, meeting her gaze with a calm that belied the storm inside. "Sue me. Take what you want. But they're my sons, and I won't deny them again." Her composure faltered, just for a second, surprise flickering in her eyes. She'd expected a fight, shouting, threats, the old William who'd matched her ruthlessness in their early years. But he wasn't that man anymore. Anna's roses, the boys' faces, her fading strength. They'd shifted something in him. A quiet resolve stronger than anger. "You're a fool," she said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You'll lose everything." "Maybe," he replied, unflinching, "but I've already lost more than you'll ever understand." Margaret stared at him, then turned on her heel, the bourbon untouched in her hand. "This isn't over," she warned, her voice echoing as she left, the door slamming shut behind her. William stood still, the penthouse swallowing the sound. His phone buzzed, Clara texting, "Anna's in the hospital, collapsed this morning." The words jolted him, sharper than Margaret's threats. He grabbed his keys, the mug still in his pocket, and headed for the door. The city blurred past as he drove, the rigs fading into the dusk, but his mind was on Rosewood Lane. Anna's cough, her steady eyes, the sons he'd failed. The hospital loomed ahead, a stark white building under fluorescent lights. He parked and strode inside, the antiseptic smell hitting him as he found her room. Anna lay in a narrow bed, an IV dripping into her arm, her face pale but her gaze sharp when it met his. Luke sat beside her, his young face tight with worry. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I did," he said, stepping closer, his tone soft but unyielding. "I'm not leaving this time." Luke looked up, his gray eyes, William's eyes, searching. "She's been asking for us," he said, hesitant. "Not you." William nodded, accepting the sting. "I know. But I'm here anyway." Anna's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. Stubborn as ever, he pulled a chair beside Luke, sitting without a word. Margaret's threat hung in the air, lawsuits, loss, but it didn't matter, not now. He'd faced her down, kept his calm, held his ground. His pride, his dignity, weren't in the penthouse or the rigs anymore. They were here, in this sterile room, with a woman he'd lost and a son he'd just found. The mug pressed against his leg, a silent vow. Whatever came next, courts, cameras, collapse, he'd face it standing tall. For them. The East Texas air carried a faint chill as William Pierce pulled up to the old lake house, its weathered wood glowing under the soft light of oil lamps hung along the porch. He'd rented it for the night, a whim born from memory, a chance to reclaim something lost. The lake shimmered beyond, a silver mirror to the past, and for a moment he saw Anna there, young and laughing, her hands muddy from planting roses. Now, 50 years later, he carried a pot of pumpkin soup, her recipe pieced together from faded recollections, and a resolve that felt both fragile and firm. He'd spent the day at the hospital, sitting by Anna's bedside as machines beeped and nurses whispered. She'd been quiet, her strength ebbing, but her hazel eyes still held that unyielding spark. David, Mark, Luke, and John had come and gone, their faces tight with worry, their glances at him a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Margaret's threat loomed, lawsuits, headlines, but he'd pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about her, or the board, or the rigs. It was about them. The door creaked open as he stepped onto the porch, Anna's boys trailing behind her wheelchair. She'd insisted on coming against doctor's orders, her flannel shirt loose over her frail frame. "One last time," she'd said, her voice a thread. William had arranged it all. Transport, a nurse on standby, because he couldn't say no. Not now. Inside, the house smelled of pine and thyme, its wooden table scarred but sturdy. William set the pot down, the steam curling up in the dim light, and turned to them. "I made this," he said, his tone steady but softer than usual. "Your mother's. Soup. Thought we could eat together." Mark crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "You think cooking fixes anything?" "No," William replied, meeting his glare without flinching. "But it's a start." David, the eldest, pulled out a chair for Anna, his movements careful. "Let's sit," he said, his voice calm, a bridge between them. Luke and John followed, their silence heavy but not hostile. Anna settled at the head, her hands folded, watching as William ladled the soup into mismatched bowls. The nurse lingered in the corner, a quiet shadow. The first spoonful was clumsy. William's hands, so steady in boardrooms, fumbled with the ladle. A splash hit the table, and Luke snorted, a half-smile breaking his guard. "Not bad for a first. Try," he said, and the tension cracked just a little. Anna took a sip, her eyes closing briefly. Close, she murmured. You forgot the nutmeg. William nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Next time, he said, and the promise hung there, fragile but real. They ate in quiet at first, the clink of spoons against ceramic the only sound. Then Anna spoke, her voice soft but clear. I taught them to plant roses, she said, glancing at her sons. Every spring we'd dig in the dirt, me and 4 little boys with muddy knees. They'd fight over the watering can. John grinned, the youngest at 28, his gray eyes bright. Mark always won. Did not, Mark shot back, but there was a flicker of warmth in it. William listened, his chest tight with a longing he couldn't name. He saw them, Anna in that garden, her hands guiding theirs year after year while he signed contracts, and shook hands a world away. I should have been there, he said, the words slipping out, raw and unpolished. Mark's spoon paused, his eyes narrowing. Yeah, you should have. So why now? What's this, guilt? A show? William set his bowl down, his hands steady on the table. He could have dodged, could have deflected, but he didn't. It's not a show, he said, his voice low, deliberate. It's the truth. I didn't know about you, any of you, until this week. Your mother wrote me. I never got it. Someone else made that choice for me, but I'm making mine now. David leaned forward, his calm breaking. And what's that choice? Showing up with soup and a sob story? No, William said, meeting his gaze. To be here. Not to fix the past. I can't. But to give you what I've got left. Time. Whatever it's worth. Anna watched him, her expression unreadable, but her hand trembled as she reached for her spoon. He's stubborn, she said to her sons, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Always was. Luke tilted his head, studying William. You taught her to tie her shoes, didn't you? She told us that once, said some boy by the lake showed her how. William's throat tightened, but he nodded. Yeah, she kept losing them. The memory hung there, a thread across decades. And for a moment the room softened. Mark's shoulders eased, just a fraction. John took another spoonful, his silence less guarded. David's eyes lingered on William, searching. I'm not asking for forgiveness, William said, his voice steady but raw. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance. To know you. To be something, even if it's late. Anna coughed, a harsh rasp that broke the stillness. And Luke was at her, sighed in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. She waved him off, her breath shallow. Enough talking, she said, her tone firm despite the weakness. Eat. They did, the meal stretching into a quiet rhythm. William watched them, Anna's strength, the boy's guarded warmth, and felt the weight of his empire slip away. The rigs, the penthouse, the board, they didn't matter here. This did. A scarred table, a bowl of imperfect soup, a family he'd lost and found too late. When they finished, he cleared the dishes, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. Anna caught his eye as he passed, her voice a whisper. You're trying, she said. That's something. He nodded, the words sinking deep. Outside, the lake reflected the stars, a mirror to a night he couldn't reclaim. But inside, under the oil lamps, he sat with them, his sons, his past. And for the first time in 50 years, William Pierce felt the stirrings of a man he might still become. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beep of machines and the faint rustle of dawn creeping through the blinds. William Pierce sat by Anna's bedside, his suit rumpled, his silver hair falling loose over his forehead. The chipped mug rested on the table beside her, a silent sentinel from a night by the lake that felt like a lifetime ago. Her breathing was shallow now, her face pale against the white sheets, but her hazel eyes still held a flicker of the woman who'd planted roses and raised 4 boys alone. David, Mark, Luke, and John stood around her, their faces etched with grief, their hands hovering as if they could hold her here. William hadn't left since the dinner. 3 days had blurred into one, hospital chairs, whispered updates, Anna, slipping further with each hour. Margaret's lawsuit had hit the news, Hargrove heiress sues Pierce over inheritance claims. But it was a distant hum, drowned by the weight of this room. He'd faced her threats with silence, his lawyer handling the noise. His fight was here, in the quiet spaces between Anna's breaths. She stirred, her hand twitching toward his. He took it, her skin cool and fragile against his calloused palm. "William," she whispered, her voice a thread. "You're still here." "Always," he said, his tone steady, though it broke him to see her like this. "I told you I wouldn't leave." A faint smile curved her lips, gone as quick as it came. She turned to her sons, her eyes softening. "Be good," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "Take care of each other." David nodded, his jaw tight. Mark blinked hard, turning away. Luke squeezed her shoulder, his voice cracking. "We will, Mom." John, the youngest, brushed a tear from his cheek, silent but fierce. Anna's gaze shifted back to William, searching. "There's a letter," she said, barely audible. "In my nightstand. For you." He squeezed her hand. A promise, without words. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and then stopped. The machines flatlined, a long, piercing note that cut through the room. Luke choked back a sob. John buried his face in his hands, and David reached for Mark, pulling him close. William sat still, her hand in his, the weight of her loss sinking deep into his bones. He didn't cry. Not yet. His discipline held, a shield against the storm inside. The nurse came, gentle and efficient, and the boys stepped back, giving him a moment. William leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Anna's, whispering, "I'm sorry." Then he stood, the mug in one hand, and left the room as dawn broke outside, a soft gold over Dallas. And so, under the quiet light of dawn, a man who once ruled the world with steel and ambition found his truest strength in the dirt beneath his nails, in the laughter of sons he'd never known, in a legacy not of wealth, but of time. It's not the end we expect for a titan. There's no grand victory, no roaring triumph, just a simple truth. Honor isn't built on what you take, but what you give back. What do you think? Can a life of power ever find peace in letting go? Drop a like if this story moved you, and hit subscribe to catch more tales of grit and grace. Until next time, keep searching for what matters.